September 1944. On a remote jungle outpost in the Philippines beneath the suffocating canopy, the air hung thick with the metallic tang of fear and a cloying, sickly sweet perfume. A U.S. Army patrol, pushing deeper into territory once thought cleared, stumbled upon a structure that seemed incongruous with the war-torn landscape, a meticulously maintained comfort station, its facade still bearing the faded cherry blossom emblem of the Japanese Imperial Army. These women, imprisoned in an unspeakable servitude, had been taught to expect only further degradation from any invading force, yet what they found in the eyes of their American liberators was not conquest, but an unthinkable offer of sanctuary. Imagine enduring years of unimaginable horror, only to face yet another liberation. What would you expect? Share your initial thoughts in the comments. Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka, a stern-faced officer of the Imperial Japanese Army, surveyed the comfort station with a detached, almost clinical gaze. For him, these women, mostly Korean, trafficked from their homes under false pretenses, were not individuals but military supplies, essential for maintaining troop morale and preventing venereal disease among his soldiers. He believed deeply in the sacred mission of the Empire, a mission that justified any means, any sacrifice. He saw order, efficiency, a necessary evil for a greater good. But even in his rigid worldview, there were cracks. He sometimes noticed the unnatural stillness in the women's eyes, the way their laughter, when it came, seemed brittle and forced, never quite reaching their eyes. A faint, almost imperceptible smell of disinfectant and cheap incense hung heavy in the air, a poor attempt at masking deeper, more putrid odors that spoke of despair, sickness, and fear. Tanaka considered it merely a hygienic necessity, a detail in the grand machinery of war, pushing away any deeper introspection. Sergeant Frank Miller, leading a small reconnaissance team, kicked open the door to the last barrack, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. Inside, huddled in the dim, humid light filtering through grimy windows, were a dozen women, their faces etched with a terror so profound it seemed carved into their very bones. Their clothes were thin and ragged, a stark contrast to the oppressive tropical heat, yet they shivered. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, scanned the American soldiers, bracing for the inevitable, for the continuation of their living nightmare under new management. Miller's immediate reaction was a gut punch of disbelief and anger. He'd seen atrocities on countless battlefields, the shredded bodies, the ravaged villages, but this was different. It wasn't the chaos of combat. It was a cold, systematic dehumanization, a calculated cruelty that chilled him to the bone. His medic, Private Rodriguez, a quiet man who usually kept his emotions locked down behind a stoic facade, audibly gasped beside him, a sound that spoke volumes of his shock. One young woman, no older than 16, her hair matted and her face gaunt, clutched a tattered, eyeless doll to her chest, her entire body trembling uncontrollably as if gripped by a relentless fever. Miller later reported that out of the initial 23 women found in that single station, at least 17 showed signs of severe malnutrition and chronic physical abuse, injuries that went far beyond neglect, bearing the hallmarks of deliberate cruelty. Field Report Perfect Rodriguez, September 18, 1944. Their condition was beyond anything I'd seen, not just physical wounds, but a profound, almost spiritual brokenness. Their gazes were hollow, expecting only more pain. They expected us to be like the others. We couldn't be. As the Americans carefully, almost hesitantly, tried to communicate, their attempts at reassurance met with blank stares and recoiling forms. The women understood little English, and the few who knew some Japanese were too terrified to speak. It was then that a micro-reveal solidified the horror. One woman, barely speaking, her voice a reedy whisper, pointed with a trembling finger to a faded, crudely tattooed number on her inner forearm. Not a name, but a numerical designation. This was a common dehumanizing practice within the Japanese imperial system, designed to strip them of their very identity, reducing them to mere chattel. They were inventory. Intelligence debriefings, pieced together from interrogations of captured Japanese soldiers and confiscated documents, began to reveal the truly monstrous scale of the enterprise. Across Southeast Asia and China, The Imperial Japanese Army had established an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 such comfort stations, exploiting an estimated 200,000 to 400,000 women. The sheer magnitude of the system, a horrifying logistical operation built on forced sexual slavery, began to dawn on the American command, making Miller's initial discovery not an isolated incident, but a single gruesome thread in a vast, tangled web of atrocity. Crumpled, heavily censored Japanese military memo, found tucked away in a discarded officer's trunk, at the very station where the women were discovered, detailed logistical requirements for female personnel, treating them no differently than ammunition, rations, or any other expendable resource of war. The cold, bureaucratic language only amplified the horror of the reality it described. Captain Thomas Mac McIntyre, Miller's commanding officer, a battle-hardened veteran whose career had forged him into a pragmatist, initially dismissed the women as a logistical headache in the middle of a brutal war zone. His immediate concern was enemy positions, troop movements, and supply lines. Women, especially these women, were an unforeseen complication. But after seeing their vacant, despairing stares in the compound courtyard and hearing Miller's raw, emotional report, his hardened military facade began to crack. The stark reality of their situation, divorced from the distant calculations of military strategy, pierced through his professional detachment. "These aren't prisoners of war, Frank," he'd said to Miller, his voice unusually quiet. "They're something else entirely. A problem we're not equipped to handle, and yet, a problem we can't ignore." Attempts to move the women to a temporary safe zone, a hastily prepared tent encampment a few miles away, were met with deep distrust, fear, and even resistance. They flinched at every male voice, every sudden movement, their eyes darting, always searching for escape routes or bracing for impact. They firmly believed they were simply being relocated for continued exploitation, perhaps by the Americans themselves, whom they had been systematically taught to fear and despise. One woman, young Me, a Korean survivor whose fragile English was pieced together over days by a sympathetic interpreter, later confessed that they had been told repeatedly by their Japanese captors, "The Americans are beasts, worse than us. They will only defile you further. Their barbaric ways know no bounds." This ingrained fear was a formidable barrier to any trust. Psychological assessments, rudimentary as they were in the chaotic environment of a combat zone, were conducted by military chaplains and what few medical officers had any psychological training. The findings were stark and consistent. Nearly 90% of the women exhibited severe symptoms of trauma, including selective mutism, chronic anxiety, profound depression, and a complete, pervasive erosion of self-worth. These symptoms were consistent with prolonged sexual and physical abuse, a systematic shattering of their individual identities and spirits. It wasn't just individual abuse, it was a systematic shattering of the human spirit. For them, basic communication, let alone the arduous journey of recovery, seemed an insurmountable challenge. A journal, crudely bound and water-damaged, was discovered hidden beneath a loose floorboard in one of the dilapidated barracks. Its pages, filled with delicate but desperate script, detailed the daily routines of abuse, the gnawing hunger, the constant fear, and the pervasive despair. It spoke of suicides that went unnoticed, of desperate escape attempts brutally suppressed, and of the crushing weight of knowing one's body was no longer one's own. It was a testament to unimaginable suffering, a silent scream etched onto fragile paper. Private Johnson, a young soldier from a conservative farm town in Kansas, found himself assigned to guard the perimeter of the women's temporary encampment. He struggled immensely with the conflicting emotions churning within him, a mix of intense disgust for what had been done to them, profound pity for their plight, and a deep-seated discomfort born of his own sheltered upbringing. He had joined the army to fight a clear enemy, not to guard victims whose suffering was so alien and disturbing. One evening, under the pale glow of a canvas lamp, he watched young Me quietly humming a Korean lullaby, a melody so soft and sorrowful it seemed to emanate from the very soul of her shattered past. In that moment, he saw past the grim label of comfort woman to the young girl she once was, a girl who, uncannily, reminded him of his own younger sister back home. The protective instinct he felt for his sister surged within him, transforming his confusion into a burning anger, an anger that shifted from the nebulous situation to the monstrous perpetrators of such evil. His initial discomfort gave way to a nascent sense of profound injustice and a quiet resolve to protect them. Word began to spread among the broader American troops in the sector. Not everyone was as sympathetic as Miller or Johnson. Some soldiers, steeped in wartime prejudices and a profound lack of understanding about the true nature of their captivity, saw them as enemy collaborators or simply prostitutes. They chose it, didn't they? One cynical corporal grumbled in the mess tent. Or they're just looking for an easy ride. This internal conflict, this moral fissure within the American ranks, threatened to undermine any efforts to help, to taint the fragile hope of sanctuary with judgment and disdain. It was a stark reminder that the enemy wasn't always just on the other side of the battlefield. The situation grew even more perilous when an intercepted coded message, originating from a retreating Japanese unit, was deciphered. The message explicitly referred to the destruction of sensitive assets, a chilling euphemism for the comfort women themselves, along with any incriminating evidence of their existence and the system that created them. This confirmed the extreme danger they were still in, making it clear that their former captors would rather see them dead than allow them to testify or serve as living proof of their crimes. It was an urgent and brutal reminder that the battle for these women's lives was far from over. Further, a fragmented map found with the earlier Japanese memo highlighted multiple other comfort stations in the immediate vicinity of their current location and further afield. This revelation solidified the understanding that Miller's initial discovery was not an isolated incident, but part of a widespread, systematic operation of institutionalized sexual slavery. The scope of the horror continued to expand, placing an immense burden on the American command. Captain McIntyre, faced with both the women's profound desperation and the logistical and moral challenges within his own ranks, felt the immense weight of his decision. He paced his tent late into the tropical nights, the humid air doing little to cool the fire in his gut. He knew that simply leaving them behind to fend for themselves, or worse, treating them as mere captives to be processed and shipped out, would be a profound moral failure, a betrayal of the very ideals his country claimed to fight for. The conventional military approach offered no satisfactory answers. He started to see this not just as a military problem, a tactical inconvenience, but as a deep, uncomfortable test of American values, a crucible where the principles of justice and human dignity would either be upheld or tarnished. He had to make a choice that transcended the standard operating procedures of war. As the American command deliberated on the fate of the liberated comfort women, amidst suggestions ranging from sending them to traditional prisoner-of-war camps, which was clearly inappropriate given their victim status, to simply letting them disperse into a war-torn landscape where they had no resources or protection, Captain McIntyre made a radical and, at the time, deeply unconventional decision. Defying established military protocols and risking severe reprimand for his perceived insubordination, he issued a directive that would redefine their understanding of military responsibility. He declared unequivocally that these women were not prisoners, nor were they merely a humanitarian burden to be passed off to another department or ignored. Instead, they would be treated as survivors in urgent need of protection, medical care, and rehabilitation. This was an act of profound compassion, a stance unheard of in the brutal calculus of war, where sentiment was often viewed as a weakness. His directive was clear: establish a secure, separate sanctuary, provide comprehensive medical and psychological care, and begin the painstaking process of identifying their origins without exploitation or judgment. This was a profound pivot, flipping the ingrained expectation of a conquering army's behavior and setting the stage for a true moral confrontation, not with the enemy on the battlefield, but with the very conscience of his own forces. The decision to shelter and rehabilitate the comfort women immediately plunged the American contingent into a complex ethical quagmire. Legally, their status was unprecedented and murky. They weren't conventional prisoners of war, nor were they ordinary civilians caught in a war zone or refugees in the traditional sense. They were victims of a state-sanctioned system of sexual slavery, a concept largely unrecognized and unaddressed in international law at the time. There were no established protocols, no rule books to follow. Psychologically, the challenge was immense, bordering on overwhelming. To address this, Captain McIntyre pulled strings to secure the deployment of Dr. Eleanor Vance, a civilian psychiatrist who had volunteered for wartime service from a field hospital in Hawaii. Dr. Vance, a woman of formidable intellect and deep empathy, arrived to find a situation far more harrowing than any she had encountered. She described the women's condition with chilling clarity. They suffered from profound complex trauma, characterized by chronic distrust, emotional numbing, and a complete erosion of self-worth. It wasn't just individual abuse, it was a systematic shattering of the human spirit. The scale of the psychological damage was staggering. Approximately 75% exhibited symptoms of what we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, making basic communication, let alone any hope of true recovery, an arduous uphill battle. The outcome of their efforts was directly tied to this understanding, providing a secure, female-led environment, allowing them autonomy over their bodies and schedules, revolutionary concepts for women who had been stripped of all agency, was deemed crucial for any hope of healing. It was less about military logistics and more about the painstaking, delicate process of reconstructing shattered souls. The mission became less about warfare and more about humanity. The sanctuary established by Captain McIntyre, a converted mission compound on the outskirts of the recently liberated town, quickly became a delicate, almost fragile beacon. For the retreating Japanese forces, it was an embarrassing loose end, a potential source of devastating testimony that needed to be silenced at all costs. For some American higher-ups, still bound by traditional military thinking, it remained a nagging distraction, an unnecessary expenditure of resources in the midst of a war. But for the women within its walls, it was the first taste of safety, though still tinged with the bitterness of past trauma. The true climax of this precarious undertaking arrived on a moonless night when a desperate Japanese scouting party, intent on silencing the women and destroying the evidence of their crimes, launched a surprise raid. Their mission was clear: eradicate the compound, eliminate the women, and leave no trace. From the perspective of Sergeant Miller, huddled behind a sandbag barricade, the roar of gunfire and the flash of muzzle blasts ripped through the jungle night. He barked orders to his men, his rifle spitting fire in return, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling his nostrils. Every shot he fired was imbued with a ferocity he hadn't known he possessed. He wasn't just defending a position, he was defending a fragile promise, a chance at life for the women he had helped liberate. Young Mi's face flashed in his mind, the face of a survivor, not a victim, a symbol of everything they were fighting to protect. The stakes felt impossibly high. Inside the main dormitory, young Mi huddled with other women, their bodies pressed together in a desperate attempt to find comfort in shared fear. She heard the explosions, the shouts, the terrifying symphony of battle raging just outside their makeshift sanctuary. Her instincts, honed by years of terror, screamed at her to hide, to submit, to make herself small and invisible. But then she saw Dr. Vance, her face pale but resolute, calmly directing frightened nurses and a few of the more stable women to secure the entrances and tend to the injured. Dr. Vance, a woman who treated her not as a commodity but as a human being worthy of respect and care, moved with purpose. Young Mi watched the American soldiers outside, not through the lens of fear she had once applied to all men in uniform, but through a new, dawning realization. They were fighting not to exploit them, not to inflict pain, but fiercely, sacrificially for them. A spark, tiny but persistent, ignited within her, a realization that this fight was different, a fight for their very dignity, a fight for the right to simply exist without fear. Captain McIntyre, overseeing the defense from a makeshift command post, knew this moment was the ultimate validation or condemnation of his decision. He watched his men fight with a ferocity he hadn't seen when merely defending supply lines or strategic positions. They were fighting for something more profound, something deeply human, something that transcended military objectives. The success of holding the compound, of repelling the desperate Japanese assault, solidified the moral imperative he had instinctively felt. These women were worth fighting for, worth protecting, no matter the cost, no matter the administrative headaches. They represented a stain on humanity that had to be acknowledged and cleansed, and he, in his small corner of the world, was doing his part. In the immediate aftermath, the successful, albeit costly, defense of the sanctuary cemented its existence and legitimacy. The story, once confined to hushed rumors, spread. It allowed hundreds more comfort women discovered in subsequent operations across the Philippines to find refuge within its secure walls. The Filipino Comfort Women Relief Center, as it was formally but quietly designated, became an anomaly in the brutal landscape of war. Its very existence directly challenged the accepted narratives of wartime conduct and helped bring nascent, uncomfortable awareness to the plight of these women, a plight previously ignored or deliberately hidden. It was a victory measured not in territory gained, but in lives slowly, painfully given back. The long-tail ripple of McIntyre's decision was slow but profoundly significant. Many women, like young Mai, supported by the dedicated American and local staff, slowly began the arduous process of reclaiming their lives. They learned to eat without fear, to speak without flinching, to dream without nightmares. Some were eventually repatriated to their home countries, only to face unimaginable challenges of stigma and shame in societies that often blamed the victims. Others, unable or unwilling to return to the places that had forgotten or disowned them, forged new lives in the Philippines, finding solace and community among their fellow survivors. Their stories, meticulously documented by Dr. Vance and her team, became some of the earliest testimonies to be collected, forming the bedrock of future historical and human rights efforts to acknowledge this hidden atrocity. Today, their ordeal echoes powerfully across decades. The fight for official recognition, apology, and reparations continues, spearheaded by human rights organizations and, tragically, by the dwindling number of surviving comfort women, now elderly and frail, their faces etched with the passage of time and the weight of memory. Their immense bravery in speaking out decades later, fueled by the memory of those who offered them shelter and the burning injustice of their past, has indelibly shaped international human rights discourse. Their testimonies serve as a stark and painful reminder of the extreme vulnerability of women in conflict zones, and conversely, of the enduring power of compassion and courage in the darkest of times. The comfort women story, once a suppressed whisper, is now a global testament, demanding that history remember, and that such horrors never be repeated. In the face of unimaginable cruelty, humanity's greatest strength isn't just to endure, but to choose compassion, to extend a hand where only a fist is expected. What would it take for you to defy orders, to risk everything, to uphold a higher moral code in the chaos of war? Hit that subscribe button if you want more untold stories from World War II that will make you question everything you thought you knew about history and remind you of the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit.